Hello, everyone. This is the 157th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I welcome back Mr. Davey Naylor of EnglandStats.com as we discuss the three Italy versus England matches in the calendar year 1997. Welcome back, Davey.
Sean, thank you. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. Glad to be back.
Can you paint a picture of the status of England and its league as the year 1997 rolled around?
I think the main talking point has to be Euro 96, which was in England that year. England had, under manager Terry Venables, had got all the way to the semi-final, losing, as probably anyone of our age probably can remember, at Wembley to Germany on penalties. It was a fantastic tournament for England. They didn't start off so great, but carried on going and reached the semi-final. In those days was the pinnacle of English achievement, getting to a semi-final. But then what happened after that? Terry Venables, his contract was not renewed after the Euros, mostly due to factors outside of football. The FA didn't really like his, shall we say, business dealings, let's just say. And they sought out a new manager, and Chelsea manager Glenn Hoddle was a great candidate. And I think prior to the actual Euros actually starting, they'd already just made that decision for Hoddle to take over. England had played 3 games in the back end of 96 after the Euro 96 finals. They had start off the World Cup 98 qualifying campaign. They had gone all the way to Moldova to win there. They'd also gone to Georgia to win and had beaten Poland at Wembley 2-1, even after going behind early on. So things on the England front had moved on, basically. Hoddle had changed the system as well. He'd gone to a 3 at the back. As for Italy, they didn't do so well in the Euros. Euro 96, they were dumped out at the group stage. They won their first game against Russia. They lost against the Czechs and needed to beat Germany. And I could only manage a 0-0 draw. Gianfranco Zola missing a crucial penalty in that game. And they went home early, despite manager Arrigo Sacchi saying it was his best ever team. He had been a manager since early in the previous World Cup campaign, 1994. He'd taken the team all the way to the final and lost out on penalties. And he was there, started off the campaign. But then he resigned in December 1996. So that threw the Italian national team into a bit of turmoil. There was many candidates, but a lot of them were on massive salaries with clubs. So the only real candidate was Cesare Maldini, who was the under-21 coach, who'd been there for 10 odd years and knew a lot of the younger players that he was bringing through into the national team. So he took over. And so that was basically where the national teams were. Now, domestic leagues at the time, I believe Milan had just won their 15th title in England. I think was it Manchester United winning their umpteenth league title again. So when 97 rolled round, there was still murmurings of 96 and England not nearly doing it. They could have done it. 98 World Cup will be that'll be our year. We've got a brand new manager. We've got some exciting young players coming through, and I think probably the Italians thought the same. They had done badly in '96, but they'd got to a final in the previous World Cup, and the way the group had been drawn, England. And this was the fault of the FIFA World Rankings at the time, because England were playing international friendlies all the time because they were hosting Euro 96. Their world ranking had dipped down to 20th. So when the draw came round, they were stuck in a group with Italy, who just reached the previous World Cup final in the previous cycle. So it was a tough group, and throw into this Poland, who were no mugs, Georgia and Moldova. It was a tough group. Both Italy and England hadn't, prior to their first meeting in February 97, they both had won all their games. But Maldini had only had, when he took over in December, he only had one friendly game against Northern Ireland in January, prior to the first England-Italy match at Wembley, to mould aside. So going into the first game, it was very raw, let's just say.
Incidentally, the sides had not faced one another since the third place match at Italia 90. Even though at club level, English and Italian sides had met one another, but somehow internationally they had avoided one another for 6 years. At this point, we have to point out that the Italian Serie A is the premier club competition in Europe and in the world. Most of the global stars are in the Serie A, but the English Premier League is gathering pace, especially following the Euro 96. Also, transfers between the clubs from respective nations was somewhat minimal up to this point. There had been a handful of top English players who had joined the Serie A during this decade: Gascoigne, Platt, Des Walker, and Paul
Yeah.
Ince. And there was mixed success with this group. While the only Italian who had traveled in the opposite direction was Andrea Silenzi, who he had a disappointing stint at Nottingham Forest in 95-96. One of the most important events in the history of football that has an impact starting this season is the Bosman ruling in 1996. This increased transfers and contact between the nations from the onset of the 96-97 season.
Well, the Bosman ruling had a major effect on global football with the abolition of transfer fees for out-of-contract players. It also put paid to the UEFA's awful quota, an EU quota, homegrown players, sort of like quotas that they had, where you could only play, I think, 3 players which weren't from your own league, who weren't trained in your own country. And yes, it increased player mobility effectively all around the globe with lots of not just European players, but also a lot of players from South America and Africa being able to move. It gave players a lot more freedom, basically, to do whatever they wanted when they were out of contract. With any club, they can move anywhere they liked. And this had a profound effect on European leagues, especially England, with a lot of new talent coming in from the continent. Italian players like Gianfranco Zola going to Chelsea.
We can add Fabrizio Ravanelli, who joined
Yeah.
Middlesbrough, Roberto Di Matteo from Lazio, who joined Chelsea, Gianluca Vialli joining Chelsea. And most important, we have to point out that the former Dutch star, Ruud Gullit, when he became player manager at Chelsea that season, he started bringing in many players that he knew from the Italian league. He may have kick-started this trend of Italian players coming to the Serie A. So those were the big names. And of course, November, December time, we have Gianfranco Zola, who was kind of being frozen out at Parma by Carlo Ancelotti. He also joins Ruud Gullit at Chelsea. And he would just have a magnificent season in the English Premier League that season. And this trend would continue into the following years with the likes of Pierluigi Casiraghi and many, many others. Even some lesser known Italian players like Gianluca Festa, who had a successful stint at Middlesbrough, or Francesco Baiano at Derby County, or Stefano Aragno. So, these Italian players who, for the longest time, had been restricted to their own league precisely because it was the best league in the world, were now able to join the English Premier League and improve the standards of the English football. Now, going back to England, ahead of this first match in February, what was the state of things with Glenn Hoddle and the team at this point?
To be honest, as we statisticians like to say, to be honest, there is insufficient data really we've only had 3 matches so far, but we do have an inkling of what his short reign will be like. He immediately abandoned a flat back four and went to a back three that he preferred. We have to talk about a young man that came into the side early on, first game straight into the side, called that everybody knows, called Andy Hinchcliffe. No, sorry. He did make his debut against Moldova, but I think everyone will know that alongside him, David Beckham made his debut on that day as well. Gary Neville, the Man United right back, had already established himself in the national side. He played during Euro '96, but this new young crop of English talent, especially from Manchester United, that you know, the class of '92 were coming through. Scholes would later on during the summer for the second England-Italy match would come into prominence as well. So Hoddle was making bold and exciting changes away from, not that Terry Venables' reign was boring, but he was certainly far from it, in fact. But he was certainly doing something a lot different. But as I said, they'd had two tricky banana skin away matches in Moldova and Georgia. They'd beaten Poland at home. So whilst we don't have much data, we can see that Hoddle's reign had started off relatively well. The big hurdle was yet to come, which was hosting Italy at Wembley in February of 1997.
And he could still rely upon Paul Ince, who was playing at Inter in
Yeah,
Milan.
Gascoigne
And
was still he was still choosing him. He
yeah,
had a lot of the old, you know, obviously Shearer was
Shearer, the captain
there.
and goal
Yeah,
scorer.
people like Ian Wright, Teddy Sheringham, and mixed in with it this new crop of exciting young players. You still have Gareth Southgate, Stuart Pearce as well was still playing, but more in a more central role rather than a kind of like his usual left back sort of role. So he had a mixture of the old guard that had been in Euro 96 and also under Graham Taylor a couple of years before as well, mixed in with some really exciting new players coming through.
And his biggest problem continued to be Paul Gascoigne
Yeah.
due to his fitness and some off the field problems that season that we can sidestep.
Here's the thing with Hoddle and Gascoigne. It was because during Hoddle's international career himself had been marginalised and sidelined quite a lot by different managers. I'm not entirely sure England managers of the 80s and knew what to do with Hoddle. He was a massive talent, but he would also could blow hot and cold. And he never really ever held down a place for any length of time. He'd struggled with injuries as well, but he was a mercurial talent that you couldn't really leave out. But sometimes he just didn't do anything. And Gascoigne was kind of like the same. And I think Hoddle struggled with Gascoigne the same way as England managers struggled with Hoddle when he was in his playing days. And we all knew that Gascoigne was a great talent, but I mean, it
Yeah.
came with a big price. I think as we go on, I mean, this is not particularly relevant to the conversation we're having, but I mean, it ended quite spectacularly with him being excluded from the 98 squad and him totally wrecking his hotel room.
As far as Italy, you already touched upon the new manager, Cesare Maldini, father of Italy captain Paolo Maldini. Obviously, Arrigo Sacchi had already been on thin ice following the disappointing Euros performance. However, he was protected because the Federation president, Antonio Matarese, was backing him. But once Matarese was ousted as president, it was obvious that Sacchi would also follow him. He would resign in December and would join his former club, AC Milan. The new FIGC, the Italian Federation President Luciano Nizzola, appointed Cesare Maldini on December 15th, 1996. At this point, Maldini was a popular choice because Sacchi was very unpopular towards the end of his tenure. And you also mentioned his only match was the friendly in January against Northern Ireland that Italy won 2-0.
He did a very interesting thing because obviously he'd been in charge of the under 21s for the last 10 years. He brought in, like Hoddle did with these young Man United players, he brought in some youngsters that he'd known from the under 21 setup, like Cannavaro. He'd thrown him in that Northern Ireland
Just
game.
about all the Italian players had been developed by him at some point, I imagine,
Yeah,
because of
yeah.
his long tenure
But
as youth manager.
so Fabio Cannavaro, we all know one of the great players, but in those days, obviously, he was very much a youngster. And it was his first, that game against Northern Ireland, he'd come on as a substitute. So the England game in February would have been his first start. Maldini had, to a certain extent, rolled the dice for the England game, but Hoddle rolled it even further, if that simile makes any sense whatsoever. They both gambled, and one came off, the other one didn't.
Do you remember where you were at this point in life when you watched this first match?
Yes, I do. I would be working in the West End of London. I think probably I would have watched this in a pub somewhere in there. I remember it distinctly. I remember the furore around Matt Letizia and his selection, and that obviously backfiring, and the grief that,
Yeah.
I mean, it was unfortunate for him. It wasn't his fault. I mean, he didn't play well, but I don't think he particularly got a chance to play well.
Speaking of Letizia, do you also remember that his brother?
Oh, yes.
Well,
Going on
go ahead.
Radio
Yeah.
Guernsey to
Yeah.
tell them everybody the team the day before. Yeah. Yeah. Although Maldini did actually say after that that he did actually play that down and saying, look, we kind of guessed the team. But don't forget, there were injuries. They didn't know if they had injuries to Ince and Adams. I think Ince did actually play, but Adams missed out. So Hoddle didn't, I don't think, really. He was waiting for last minute fitness tests for a lot of players. So he
Yeah.
was.
Not to mention starting goalkeeper David Seaman, who missed this match.
He missed the match, but I think that was a much later on. I think he injured himself in the warm up or on the day of the game. So Ian Walker had
Yeah.
to step in. I know that Adams missed out, but
Also, Southgate and Gascoigne were
yeah.
unavailable as
But
well.
Ince did actually make it. He passed a late fitness test, surprisingly, that which surprised everyone except Carl Letizia, yeah, throwing in Matt Letizia, who hadn't had a cap for several months, and he was thrown in as a kind of like a dual striker. Shearer had mostly been previously been up on his own in previous games, but Hoddle liked the idea of them two playing together. But as I said, it didn't quite work so well, and Letizia was hoiked off after an hour to be replaced by Les Ferdinand.
For this match on February 12th, 1997, at London at Wembley, the World Cup qualifier. For England, we have the following lineup: Ian Walker of Tottenham in goal, Sol Campbell of Tottenham, Stuart Pearce of Nottingham Forest, Gary Neville of Manchester United, Graham Lasaw of Blackburn Rovers, David Beckham of Manchester United, Paul Ince of Inter in Italy, David Batty of Newcastle. He'll be replaced by Ian Wright of Arsenal in the 89th minute. Steve McManaman of Liverpool. He'd be replaced by Paul Merson of Arsenal in the 77th minute. Matthew Letizia of Southampton in his final cap. He'd be replaced by Les Ferdinand of Newcastle in the 61st minute. And Alan Shearer of Newcastle, captain of the team. Incidentally, and we'll get to the goal where Ian Walker, he was blamed for his positioning for this goal. It later turned out that he was actually hiding an injury and had concealed it for a number of weeks. And he was taking painkiller injections into his shoulder.
When you read that team sheet out, it doesn't sound particularly different, except when you realise that Gary Neville, Stuart Pearce, and Sol Campbell are playing as three centre backs, with Lasso as a left wing back and David Beckham as a right wing back, with Ince and Batty in the middle, which, as a partnership goes, is pretty solid. You've got McManaman as an advanced midfielder, and then you've got Letizia and Shearer up front. So you've got the width with the two wing backs, and also you've got a central spine which is quite narrow. So it looks odd because of the personnel. But then in those days, people like Gary Neville was only his 17th cap. Sol Campbell, it was only his fourth cap. So we didn't kind of know, as we know now, these players, their strongest positions. So it does look a little bit lopsided, this team, with players being played out of position. I think the Italians identified the biggest threat, which was Shearer, and they man-marked him. They got Alessandro Costacurta to man-mark Shearer out of the game. And without his influence, Letizia became basically, for Southampton, he was happy coming deep and playing as an attacking midfielder, but he was an out and out striker in this. But with Shearer being marked off the ball, he dried up. He had one good chance in the first half, which he missed. He fluffed. But other than that, that was effectively his game.
As far as Italy, we have the following lineup: Angelo Peruzzi of Juventus in goal, Ciro Ferrara of Juventus, Alessandro Costacurta of AC Milan, Fabio Cannavaro of Parma, Paolo Maldini of AC Milan, captain of the team, Angelo Di Livio of Juventus, Roberto Di Matteo of Chelsea, Demetrio Albertini of AC Milan, Dino Baggio of Parma, Pierluigi Casiraghi of Lazio. He'd be replaced by Fabrizio Ravanelli of Middlesbrough in the 76th minute. Gianfranco Zola of Chelsea, and he'd be replaced by Diego Fuser of Lazio in the 90th minute. Cesare Maldini, he installed a 5-3-2 formation. Costa Curta was a libero. Ferrara and Cannavaro were in the center of defense ahead of him. And on the flanks, you have Di Livio on the right and Maldini on the left. Di Matteo, Albertini, and Dino Baggio were in midfield, and Casiraghi and Zola up front. So this match is decided in the 19th minute. On the right side, in his own half, Costa Curta sent a long cross that Zola controlled, and then from a somewhat narrow angle, shot and scored for Italy. Italy would hold on for this crucial win. At this point, it looked like Italy's group following this win.
You can imagine the tabloid reaction. They all blamed Letizia, basically. It sadly ended his international career, his very short international career, never played again. Hoddle was a bit more phlegmatic about it. I mean, he says there's no way that England are out. Don't forget, this qualifying campaign, only the winning team in the group, the top team in the group, were qualified automatically. The second place team would go into a playoff against another second place team, which would happen in the November of 97. So England weren't out. Hoddle was trying to, in the press conferences after that, he was trying to reassure people that, there's a long way to go. Italy have to go to Tbilisi and to Moldova as well. And they all have got to go to both got to go to Poland. So, and there's the return leg in Rome later on in the year. So England aren't out, but the Italians are in pole position here. Interestingly, the Zola goal turns out to be the last one England concede in this qualifying game. They only concede two. One was against Poland and then this one. So they keep clean sheets for the rest of the qualifying campaign. But we don't know that yet.
Interestingly, the two sides were also invited for a summer tournament in France, Le Tournoi, which, as is tradition nowadays, the host country of a tournament in the summer previously, kind of like the Umbro Cup in 95. The host country have like a dress rehearsal tournament.
Yeah, like a test event, isn't it?
Yeah.
Make sure everything works fine and yeah.
Yeah, but this one was very prestigious with host France and special guests Brazil, England, and Italy. Italy and England would face each other one more time in addition to the World Cup qualifiers. This was in June of 1997. Let's look at the lineups for this match on June 4th, 1997. While Glenn Hoddle was enthusiastic for this tournament, the Italian manager Cesare Maldini was completely opposed to this tournament that he had inherited, would have preferred for his players to rest rather than play in this tournament. Now, looking at the lineups, the matches played at Nantes at Stade de la Beaujoire in France. We have the following lineup for England. Tim Flowers of Blackburn Rovers in goal. Martin Keown of Arsenal, Gareth Southgate of Aston Villa, Stuart Pearce of Nottingham Forest, Phil Neville of Manchester United, David Beckham of Manchester United, Paul Scholes of Manchester United, captaining the team, Paul Ince of Inter in Italy, Graham Lasaw of Blackburn Rovers. He'd be replaced by Gary Neville in the 46th minute, Teddy Sheringham of Tottenham. He'd be replaced by Paul Gascoigne of Rangers Glasgow in the 79th minute. Ian Wright of Arsenal. And he'd be replaced by Andy Cole of Manchester United in the 77th minute. So it's almost a completely different team than the February encounter for England.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, you're just about to name the Italian team, which is almost exactly the same. The only difference between the team is Paolo Maldini is not playing. He's been replaced by Benarivo.
For the Italians, we have Angelo Peruzzi of Juventus in goal, Angelo Di Livio of Juventus. He'd be replaced by Giampiero Maini of Vicenza in the 46th minute, Ciro Ferrara of Juventus. He'd be replaced by Alessandro Nesta of Lazio in the 46th minute. Captain of the team in Maldini's absence, Alessandro Costa Curta of AC Milan, Fabio Cannavaro of Parma, Antonio Benarivo of Parma, as you mentioned. Roberto Di Matteo of Chelsea. He'd be replaced by Diego Fuser of Lazio in the 17th minute. He was injured early on. Demetrio Albertini of AC Milan. Dino Baggio of Parma. Pierluigi Casiraghi of Lazio, and Gianfranco Zola of Chelsea. As you mentioned, the Italian team is very similar to the February matchup. As far as the match itself, England are fresher. They win this match 2-0 with 2 goals in the first half.
They've freshly come off the weekend before. They'd freshly gone to Poland and beaten the Poles 2-0. So they were very buoyant going into this tournament. I mean, that's a tough place to go and get 3 points. So they were very, very, very pleased at this point. Don't forget also this tournament that the night before, on the 3rd of June, Brazil had played France, and we'd seen the most amazing goal of Roberto Carlos.
Oh, yes. The free
Everybody
kick.
remembers the way this ball just bends in and it goes inside Fabian Barthez. The tournament has started off brilliantly, and then the next night in Nantes, obviously England are playing Italy again. England team is slightly different. The Italian team is very much the same, but as you say, the two sides come at it totally different attitudes. Hoddle is excited about this tournament. It's a dress rehearsal. Hoddle knows that he's got to play Italy again in Rome in November, so this is a good dress rehearsal of, because it went so wrong in February, for him to get this right. If England can beat Italy here, it'll set down a massive marker for that game. And don't forget, Italy had dropped points as well.
I think they got a scoreless tie in Poland, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. And England had won there. So England were now, and as it turns out, all they do need is a draw in the end. But because I think Italy dropped more points in Georgia, I think, as well, off the top of my head. Things are looking up for Hoddle and England. And going into this tournament, it's a good way to get revenge for that February game and to right the wrongs, those gambles that didn't pay off, to set down a real big marker for this November game coming up, the most crucial one. And England, with a new young starlet under the name of Paul Scholes, goals from him and from Ian Wright as well. They look a much different side than the Italians. The Italians look tired and, not really that interested in this game. And England run out easy winners, really, in the end.
The first goal is in 26th minute when, from his own half, Paul Scholes sends a long cross to Ian Wright, who, after a bounce, volleyed it in from the left side. England scored the second in the 44th minute. Stuart Pearce passed to Ian Wright, and his cross from the left side was struck in by Paul Scholes. England win 2-0. You mentioned the match against Poland just days earlier, the World Cup qualifier. So as a result of that, Alan Shearer, David Seaman was rested. Sol Campbell and Graham Lasalle were also rested. For England, it was not the full strength team. But they played, like you said, with much more energy than the Italians. The takeaway from the Italians was that they needed rest and proper preparation.
Yeah. Yeah, and England just went from strength to strength. They then played the host France and won that game. And this is a really good France side that actually do end up winning the World Cup the year later. So that's not an easy feat. They do actually lose the last game to Brazil, Romario goal, but they come top of that and they win the tournoi, which is the first tournament, albeit a friendly tournament, the first bit of silverware that England have won since 1966.
And the picture of Alan Shearer holding it up, no one has ever looked that unhappy to hold a trophy.
Yes, I mean, not including obviously the home championship, the British Championship, which obviously was competed up until 1986, and there was some other minor tournaments. But I don't consider this particularly a minor tournament. I mean, yes, it is a friendly tournament, you can say, but the quality of the teams, Italy, one of the best teams in the world, France, who become world champions a year later, and Brazil. I mean, you can never rule Brazil out. This is a great little tournament, and the football that was played, pretty good. Italy played Brazil, and that was 3-3. It was a fantastic game. They also play France 2-2. Yeah, the Italians look a bit tired, but there's been a long season, I guess. But for the English team, they've got getting a second win now. They've got that defeat from Italy out of their system, and now they're going from strength to strength, finishing off this qualifying campaign in style.
So we come to the fall of 1997 and the crucial third match. Can you explain the context of this last match as far as where each team stood and what each team needed to win this group?
Italy had dropped some points. They dropped points in Poland, they dropped points in Georgia. England were actually now ahead of Italy in this final group game. It was down to if Italy won the game, they would qualify automatically. If England drew or won, they would qualify automatically, which added to the spice of the game. So it was vitally important for both teams, but England only needed a draw. They only needed to hold on, and they hadn't conceded since that Zola goal back in February in qualifying campaign. And they went into this game knowing that obviously they had beaten Italy the last time they played them, and it was such a crucial game. I remember the press were very tense. The losers would eventually go up and be paired with Russia in a qualifying playoff, which I do believe Italy won anyway. I mean, it wasn't life and death, like the one team wasn't going to qualify for the World Cup, but having to do another two-leg playoff was certainly something you didn't want to. And England had managed to, by the Italian slip-ups, managed to get themselves back into pole position, even though they had lost at Wembley. So if they could just hang on and see this game through, Hoddle also, his team choice is setting up very defensively. He's kind of playing for that draw as well. So, I mean, he doesn't have Shearer available, sadly, but he does do a small gamble, which is bringing Paul Gascoigne. We had in Adams back as well. It was helped out a lot by the way the Italians played, especially the Delivio red card, which eased things later on in the game.
For the first time in his matches, he had David Seaman in goal as
Yes, that's true as
England's
well.
number
Yeah.
one, and Gascoigne as well starting, like you mentioned. And Ian Wright would fill in for Alan Shearer, who was out after a serious injury in July and would only be back in January 1998. As far as the Italians, Cesare Maldini, he went with a 4-4-2 formation that later Glenn Hoddle felt it played into their hands. So the match on October 11th at Rome at Stadio Olimpico, we have the following lineup. For Italy, we have Angelo Peruzzi of Juventus in goal, Alessandro Nesta of Lazio, Fabio Cannavaro of Parma, Alessandro Costacurta of AC Milan, Paolo Maldini, captain of the team from AC Milan. He'd be injured and replaced in the 32nd minute by Antonio Benarivo of Parma, Angelo Di Livio of Juventus, Dimitrio Albertini of AC Milan, Dino Baggio of Parma, Gianfranco Zola of Chelsea. He'd be replaced by Alessandro Del Piero of Juventus in the 64th minute, Christian Vieri of Atletico Madrid in Spain, Filippo Inzaghi of Juventus, and he'd be replaced by Enrico Chiesa of Parma in the 46th minute. Yeah, there was a lot of bookings in this match. I think Italy had 6 players booked, and Di Livio earned his second booking in the 77th minute and was sent off.
I'll make it 7 for the Italians and 3 for the English. Yellow card. Obviously, Delivio got 2.
Yeah, exactly. And for English, we have Campbell, Gascoigne, and Southgate getting booked.
Yeah.
But looking at the England lineup, you have David Seaman of Arsenal in goal, Tony Adams of Arsenal, Sol Campbell of Tottenham, Gareth Southgate of Aston Villa, Graham Lusso of Chelsea, captain of the team Paul Ince of Liverpool, Paul Gascoigne of Rangers Glasgow. He replaced by Nicky Butt of Manchester United in the 87th minute, David Batty of Newcastle, David Beckham of Manchester United, Teddy Sheringham of Manchester United, and Ian Wright of Arsenal.
First thing to say is the Italians are hampered by Maldini's injury. He goes into a tackle with Ince about 25 minutes in, twists his left ankle. He tries to play on, but then he has to by 5 minutes later, he can't continue, and Benarivo has to replace him. So that's a massive blow, losing your captain and central defender. And then the second thing that is quite instrumental is Delivio's red card, which, I mean, the second yellow, he gets one for tackling Lasso, I think, in the first half, and then the two-footed challenge on Campbell in the second half in the 77th minute. I mean, to be honest, I think it's worthy of a red on its own, to be honest. I think that the referee went, well, either or, you're going off anyway. And that seriously helped England out. I mean, I wouldn't say they were struggling during this game. In fact, they had a lot of really good chances to actually take the lead, but that just eased the pressure. Having their best defender off and then down to 10 men, it made it much simpler. And I wouldn't say it was a nasty game, but there were a lot of challenges. People might remember Paul Ince cutting his head and having a white bandage over his head. That was actually an accidental head clash with, I think it was Albertini. I think he gets a bit of elbow.
Yes.
He had to go off and have 3 stitches in his head. But then later on, when he comes back on, the wound opens up again and blood is pouring from his bandages. It was a battle, let's just say.
The dramatic events right at the end on both sides.
Yeah.
Where Ian Wright is clear and seemingly is about to score, but he hits the post. And then in the following action, Italy gets the ball to the front, and there's a header by Vieri that he almost scores with. Yeah, a lot of excitement. Despite the scoreless tie, it was a match where everyone was on the edge.
I genuinely believe it's one of the best 0-0s I've ever seen. It was that good a game. It really was. It had everything. It had everything apart from a goal. But then at the time, I didn't care really because we didn't need to score as long as we didn't concede.
Did you know that Inzaghi had a fever, but Maldini chose to start with him anyway?
I guess that's why he goes off at half time, I presume. Yeah, because he didn't know that.
For this match, every time Italy attacked, there were just a wall of English players defending. Italy just could not find a way through.
There was lots of in the press, the vitriolic press afterwards. Like, it was absolutely opposite of the game in February, where English Lions and everybody had a picture of bloodied Paul Ince. It reminded a lot of people of Terry Butcher years previously with the bloody bandage around the head, and everybody was defending. But the Italians they needed to score, so they left gaps at the back as they were coming forward in their desperation to score. So there were lots of chances. England didn't just sit back, because Hoddle knew that the best form of defence was attack. If you've still got the ball, they can't score if you've got the ball. So he deliberately tried to make sure that England push forward, try and, because if they got a goal, it would make the job even easier. But there were times when they had to just defend and defend and defend. And it helped that they had people like Paul Ince. So it was kind of like your wing backs were Lasso left wing back, and Beckham was right wing back. It was Gascoigne and Ince, Batty who were the midfield three, but they kind of like protected those 3 centre backs as well. Every now and again the 2 wing backs would go forward. There was space behind there, so they really thought that they could nick a goal at the end. They didn't, but it didn't matter in the end.
Incidentally, England played with a different goalkeeper in each of these matches.
Yes. Yeah, Walker and then Flowers and then Seaman, yeah.
As the World Cup arrived, many of these protagonists would be missing. Surprisingly, Gianfranco Zola missed out in the World Cup of 1998. I don't remember if he was injured, because it was surprising a player of his stature was cut from the national team.
Italy lost on penalties to France in the quarter-final. Is that right?
Yes,
in 98?
yes.
Yeah. So they'd gone out 3 World Cups in a row on penalties, I believe.
Yes. Angelo Peruzzi, who was supposed to start for Italy in the World Cup, he also had a late injury ahead of the World Cup, and Gianluca Pagliuca was Italy's goalkeeper during the World Cup.
Right, yeah.
And as far as England, Ian Wright missed out at the World Cup. And Gascoigne, of course, who at this point, he would have been everyone's bet to be present at the World Cup, especially after this match in Rome. But yeah, we all know what happens. And with Ian Wright, I think towards the end of the season, Nicolas Anelka at Arsenal is edging ahead of him in the lineup. And I think he's not a starter towards the end of the season. So he is also left out of
the other interesting one, which you wouldn't necessarily think it would be first choice, but Phil Neville misses out. His brother Gary goes, but Phil Neville misses out. But Phil, the reason why I mentioned Phil, because he never held down a place regularly, but because he was such a utility player, he could play left back, he could play right back, he could play centre defence, he could actually play in midfield as well. So I thought that was an odd choice not to take someone with his versatility to the World Cup. But I guess the emergence of young Michael Owen came along. I mean, we hadn't heard of Michael Owen until really back end of this season, and he just burst on the scene. And I think you could only take 22 players, and I think probably that might be why Gascoigne missed out. Might have been Michael Owen, but the Gascoigne thing was a big shock. Definitely. None more so to Paul Gascoigne, clearly.
Yeah. On balance, do you think England came away looking better just because they finished better?
Results say no because England, whilst during the '98 World Cup, they beat Tunisia and then they lost to Romania, despite getting back into the game with a Michael Owen goal, and then comfortably beat Colombia. But then in the second round, they were pitted against Argentina, which another instant classic, which we talked about in great detail.
So, do you think maybe there was a false sense of hope for the World Cup after this match against Italy?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I certainly had a false sense of hope with these new young players. We had a charismatic young manager, new players like Beckham, Scholes, Michael Owen, very exciting players. I mean, which we witnessed in that World Cup. So there was a lot to be excited about. Absolutely. I can't speak for the Italians. I think probably Tharcio actually thought that it was his best team was the '96 team. So to build on that, you had new players coming through like Cannavaro, those sort of players, coupled with older experience. So I think both teams thought they had a good chance. The Italians obviously had to get through against Russia, but once they'd done that playoff, I think they thought they had a very good chance to go a long way into that tournament. France were always going to be favourites, having being hosts as well, and the talent that they had. And it just so happened that the Italians came up against them. England, well, a lot of things went right and went wrong in that game against Argentina, which, if you look back at it now, really should have won that game. But, the Beckham red card and penalties, which are always England's bête noire. It's predictable nowadays. But yes, in October after that game, I'm sure. I mean, it wasn't quite dancing in the streets in London, but we were close to that, having been behind it, the Italians having it go wrong at Wembley, and then we bring it back with such a great performance as it was in Rome. I think that's a win in anyone's book, and I think the way the team was shaping up with a World Cup on the horizon, and they'd done so well in this tournoi in the summer, absolutely. Why couldn't we win it? Why couldn't we do that? As
Yeah.
for the Italians, as I said, I can't quite tell you where they were in everything, but I still think they were confident that they could do well. Of course, you don't go into a World Cup thinking you've got to give yourself a chance. Say, yeah, we can win this. I think Hoddle believed he could win it, and I think, although I'd like to say that if they'd have got past Argentina, they would have played the Dutch. I mean, that was a good team as well.
And then
So,
Brazil.
and then Brazil. So it would have been a really tough run to get, and then France in the final. Yeah. So, they were the big teams. It was a tough draw England had got, even if they had got through. I don't know. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe they could have got through. But yeah. And then sadly, we lost Hoddle because of remarks that he made later on, which didn't quite fit the mentality. So he was ousted, which I do think was a shame because I do really like Hoddle as a manager. I thought he was like Venables before him. He was innovative with his. We lost two managers there who I think really could have done really well for the English side, but they only lasted 2 years or so, which was a great shame. And then we had the Keegan years, which sadly we all know what happened there. Looking back on that October day in '97, yes, I thought we were going to rule the world. Sadly, no. Typical English attitude, really. We always think we're going to win something and never do. That's why, it's coming home is kind of like an ironic chant. Everybody thinks that the English are very arrogant going around. It's coming home. It's coming home. No, we just like irony, really. It's never going to come home. We're just fooling ourselves.
Has your outlook and memories of these matches changed from that of a younger fan to an older fan now?
It's interesting watching the games back. It's very interesting. I mean, I do remember this period, the kind of the Euro 96, 98 World Cup, that period, the Turn War de France. I do remember that period very, very well. And I look back on it with a kind of like fondness because the way that England were playing, you can look back and watch the matches again and be a little bit more critical about it. But and it's very interesting what you find and things that you'd forgotten. Oh, I've forgotten about that. That was very interesting little thing. And some of the players that Hoddle had used, like I mentioned, Andy Hinchcliffe, who got his debut alongside David Beckham. That didn't last long. He was supposed to be a new talent coming through as well. The whole Gascoigne thing, Shearer still scoring, the new Michael Owen coming through, young 18-year-old kid. It was an exciting era. It was a good time to be watching football, and I'm very nostalgic about those years. Never went anywhere. Hopes and dreams were dashed once again, but I do look back on those years fondly. It was also about the time that I was actually considering starting England stats as well, which that was the kernel of the idea.
Internet was in its, well,
Yeah,
I won't say it was in its infancy. It was around this time that I think the internet was picking up, right?
yeah, that's and what I had done was I had all of these. I had a massive spreadsheet. That's where it all started. It was in a massive Excel spreadsheet with all of these names and dates and stuff like that. And I thought, well, I can't keep updating this. This is taking forever. So a friend of mine suggested, why don't we start a website? So that was born around about 1998, so just before that World Cup. So I was already had done the spreadsheet. I was already keeping the stat from about this time. So the first iteration of the website, which was very, very, very basic, was born around about that time. So yeah, that was when I was really getting into doing the football stats. So yeah, it's a fun time to look back on.
In closing, what is the lasting legacy of these three encounters in the calendar year 1997? Are we just looking back on this mostly due to nostalgia nowadays, or there's more to these matches?
I guess they are nostalgic. I mean, they certainly are for me. I don't know about any of your other listeners, but they were three very different games. It's rare to play at international level, rare to play teams so many times in since the days of the British Championship. You know, we used to play Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland quite regularly. So, you don't normally play three games against one team. Incidentally, back in 2012, we kind of did it again. We played Italy in the quarterfinal of Euro 2012, and then the very next game was a friendly game against Italy again. The games are so different. The first one is great for Italy, bad for the English. Two new managers who have rolled the dice a little bit, and one's paid off, one hasn't. And then the second match where one team is a little bit more interested than the others. And then the third match where both teams are very much interested. The intensity ramps up every game. And the fun finale, even though it's a nil-nil draw, as I said before, it's the most interesting nil-nil draw I've ever seen. And that rivalry, because there's just one place to go to the World Cup. I mean, England and Italy had been in qualifying campaigns before. I think in the 70s,
Right,
England.
1978 World Cup, yeah.
Exactly, that England missed out because there was only one place. There was no playoff this time. But what you didn't want to do is have to go to Russia, although they didn't know that at the time. They hadn't been drawn yet. We didn't want to have to go to Russia to qualify. See, so each game is totally different for totally different reasons. The personnel don't change too much. The managers don't change, but the tactics do. The formations are relatively the same, but the intensity of each game they stand out on each one of their on their own. So I think that they live long in the memory because of the way. I mean, I don't. If you can ask an Italian, I don't know what they would say. I certainly, as an Englishman, those three games are very important. In that year, that was it. Those three games are the three ones I can remember. Even before you even asked me to on this podcast, if you say to me, pick a game in 1997, I would have said, well, the three Italian games because of their importance to England football. So those three games really shaped the way that Hoddle's England were going to play. Sadly, the World Cup didn't really happen, and then soon afterwards, '99, next year he was gone, and we're on to a different manager. They are very important games in the English canon, I'd say.
With that, I would like to thank you for your continuous participation in this series. All our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Davey, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on English football history.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm trying to make sure everything on the website is as accurate as possible. And the way that I think I can do that is to try and find as many matches, full length matches on YouTube, on different platforms to watch as possible. My goal is I'm up to 350 odd games now, and I want to get to 500. A lot of them I can get on YouTube and other platforms that are free, but then some I'm going to have to buy. So I've done a little crowdfunder little thing. It's on Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/England stats. If anybody loves going onto the site, losing a couple of hours down a rabbit hole on that, and you want to help us try and get our matches up to 500, that basically what we do, we watch the matches and every single bit of data we go through and make sure it's down to the second. Yellow card substitutions, we do it to the second because we reckon that's the best way to be accurate. So all those timings we take off there, and we double check every single statistic that we have on our matches. And if you like going on England stats, please donate something, a quid, 2 quid, 3 quid, whatever you feel like, and we can try and make it the most accurate England football site out there. Thank you.
Certainly a worthy endeavor. Thanks again. Catch up next time for more England football history.
Yes, delighted to.